that family that begins to be called to you by the ethers now becomes those individuals that you will be able to develop a reliance on in future times. And your success and your failures are intrinsically linked to one another. Another key piece, when you're developing that spiritual family, you realize that you need each other, and this is the relationship that you had been looking for, but you weren't able to really have until you were willing to be born again. You see, because sometimes you'll come in contact with someone like that, and you'll start to feel, maybe there's a spark or an ember of a possibility of a relationship like that, but you haven't gone through your rebirth. So as a result, you're actually really not ready for it, and you start to process it as something that it's not. So sometimes people will infuse a whole lot of romanticism in it, and they'll infuse a whole lot of intimacy, and they'll get confused, or even attraction, and not realize that it's a much greater form of relationship. And because you're now calling upon, or you're beckoning, or you're yearning for that spiritual connection and that spiritual family, your relationship with your blood family begins to change. And one of the reasons that the relationship with the blood family changes is because you're changing. And the things that they were able to provide for you in your first infancy, in your first, formative years, they can no longer provide for you, because now you're calling on something greater. So what happens now is that the Creator now creates distance, Olokun, creates distance between you and your blood family. And that distance is necessary because what it does is it gives you enough space apart in order for you to start to cultivate a new freedom, so you can start things new, so you can begin things on this second birth. Because a lot of times when you're still, and I'll say you have this closeness emotionally or mentally or even physically, it becomes very difficult to cultivate these new thoughts that are coming and take this new breath, that's trying to fill your lungs. Because again, you have all of those very immediate influences, if you will. So one of the important things where sometimes people they pride themselves in is the rejection of their blood family. And I typically tend to tell people not to do that. You shouldn't deny your family, or your blood family, or reject your family, because you got to understand that like you hear me sometimes, even as the book Solutions for Dysfunctional Relationships, you hear me talk about the launch pad or the springboard, right? So even if you're springing into greatness, or you're springing into this wonderful destiny that, awaits for you, whether you know it or not, regardless of anything, it is that originating family, that blood family, that's the base, or the launch pad that you sprung from. Discernment is very important, because sometimes you'll meet people who are at that stage like you are, but you're going to meet a lot of people who think they're at that stage, but in truth, they're not. That's the big one. That's the really big one. And sometimes when you're first being born again, just like any infant, any child, you don't necessarily have the aptitude and the filtering for that level of discernment to really be able to see. So you come out of something and you have a certain story, and sometimes maybe what you came out of, there's some pain associated with that. And via that pain, you bond. And you assume because you can bond via your pain, you're also bonding at the same time via the truth that's now coming alive in you. And often that's just not the case at all. This is highly prevalent. You see, like in a lot of places where you have women's ministries. Very tricky. Very, very tricky to have a women's ministry. It's a lot of work. And I'm going to tell you why, because women tend to galvanize themselves together over trauma, and not necessarily over truth, but just over trauma. And I'm going to address that at another time. But sometimes that bonding, that sisterhood that's developed over our pain becomes, I'm not a woman, but becomes the entire experience. That's all that's really discussed. That's all that's really looked at. And if truth is introduced and it triggers a pain choice or pain reaction, then, now it becomes shunned in that environment. So